Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a text that's probably going to flip everything you thought you knew about Jean-Jacques Rousseau completely upside down. It uses a really unconventional format, a spiritual interview, to reinterpret the famous Enlightenment thinker, and in doing so, it offers a radical new lens on modern education, genius, and politics. Whether you're a philosophy buff or just curious about how historical ideas shape the world we live in today, this text forces us to look at concepts we thought we had figured out centuries ago in a completely different light.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll look at the true intentions, according to Rousseau's spirit, unpack the misunderstanding around Tory education, explore school education versus the birth of genius, dig into the real meaning of the general will, and finally, touch on the role of religion in preventing tyranny.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the true intentions, according to Rousseau's spirit.
The source text we're looking at is titled Spirituality and Education. And what's really fascinating here is the framing. It presents itself as a channeled dialogue with the spirit of Rousseau himself. Now, without getting bogged down in the spiritual mechanics of how that works, we're simply going to explore the arguments it presents. It uses this deeply unique framework to challenge some seriously entrenched societal norms.
To really appreciate the pivot this book makes, we kind of have to ground ourselves in Rousseau's historical legacy first. You know him, right? He's a titan of Enlightenment thinking, the author of the groundbreaking educational treatise Emile, and a massive champion of human equality. Setting that stage makes the shift we're about to discuss, how his ideas have allegedly been totally distorted in modern times, that much more dramatic.
Moving right along to Section 2, the misunderstanding of Tory education.
The book points out this massive societal misunderstanding of Rousseau's famous phrase, return to nature. You see this a lot when people try to justify relaxed schooling policies, like Japan's Tory education. Modern systems often interpret return to nature as literally just leaving kids alone in a primitive state to do whatever they want without any rigorous study. But the text argues this was never about lazy abandonment. Nature actually refers to a child's pure, uncorrupted state. And true education, it's about actively polishing that innate brilliance. So according to this channeled text, proper education is actually an active, highly involved refining process. It is literally the exact opposite of passive neglect disguised as freedom. It's about stripping away all that societal corruption to reveal this incredible inner potential and then working really hard to make it shine.
Which brings us to Section 3, School Education and the Birth of Genius.
Now, the book absolutely acknowledges the social merits of free public schooling. Especially during financial crises, it can be a great political decision, helping talented youth, maybe those in literature or art who would otherwise need wealthy patrons just to survive. But the text issues a pretty stark warning here. State-run systems are fundamentally engineered from the top down for standardization. They're just not built to nurture exceptional mold-breaking outliers. The text willingly concedes that modern public schooling is actually highly successful at what it was built to do, mass-producing capable average citizens. It successfully raises the baseline of a nation's literacy and basic competence. But the trade-off? You're trading individual brilliance for collective uniformity.
And because of that exact uniformity, the source delivers a truly surprising claim. It argues that if Rousseau were alive today, our modern school system might completely reject him. He'd probably be labeled a dropout, a failure, or maybe even a hikikomore, a social shut-in. The argument is that true genius almost always has to forge a path entirely outside of state control, because standardizing everything is the ultimate enemy of revolutionary thought.
Let's dive into Section 4, the true meaning of the general will. Okay, this definition completely flips traditional political science on its head. In most textbooks, the general will is taught as the ultimate secular authority of the citizens, period. But the book argues Rousseau never actually meant it to be an absolute. Instead, it was supposed to be a temporary placeholder. Think of it as a backup plan for human consensus in an age where direct divine revelation or prophetic guidance just couldn't be confirmed.
The text strongly emphasizes that it's a grave historical mistake to use the general will to justify atheism or to push this idea that the majority is always right. When you contrast our modern, purely secular interpretation with the book's deeply spiritual framework, you see that the general will is inherently flawed. It desperately needs moral and spiritual checks and balances simply because human consensus on its own can be incredibly dangerous.
And this philosophical misunderstanding is not just some dry academic debate, it's genuinely dangerous. Elevating human consensus to the level of absolute truth has historically allowed angry mobs to run completely out of control. The text actually points to the massive bloodshed of the French Revolution as a prime example of what happens when the general will is stripped of its spiritual context and morphs into violent tyranny.
This perfectly sets up Section 5, the role of religion in preventing tyranny.
This brings us to the source's ultimate conclusion. When mob rule or a runaway democratic majority threatens to destroy society, or when it starts infringing on deeper moral truths, religious leaders have a very specific duty. According to the text, they must step outside the popular consensus and act as the essential and often highly unpopular voice of warning.
The book argues that human arrogance, this idea that our collective vote somehow magically creates absolute moral truth, has to be tempered by a higher perspective. It warns that unchecked democratic power can so easily transform into a dictatorship of the majority, where society completely loses sight of what is actually good or just.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to wrap up our explainer today. The source really forces us to hold up a mirror to our own society. Think about our modern era, where absolute public consensus and social media outrage often dictate what's considered true. If the general will runs out of control today, who is actually brave enough to stand up and issue that necessary warning? It's a heavy question, and it absolutely makes us rethink Rousseau, our approach to education, and the very foundation of our democracy.